Well, Jay, another special episode and a very special person we get to talk with today. It's going to be Serona Elton. She is the head of educational partnerships at the MLC, and she is also the interim dean at the Frost School of Music over at the University of Miami, someone I've met actually in person when I was at Music Tectonics, and I'm looking forward to this one.
Yeah, it was a really good conversation. We talked about, the growing role of data managers in the music industry, to maintain accurate metadata and to track income, but also the importance of understanding the difference between musical works and sound recordings in copyrights. And she talked about how her students are particularly passionate about issues of compensation in the music industry today. So now, without further ado, here's Serona Elton. Let it roll.
Stand by for transmission.
This is London calling.
Wake up! The revolution is at hand! Your morning coffee is on the air. On the air, on the air, on the air, on the air, on the air.
Standing by.
Your morning coffee, the weekly music news for the new music business. It's the highly curated, agitated, advocated, moderated, and liberated digital music information that you need to know. We are your digital music authority. And now from our studios in Hollywood, California, here's your hosts, Jay Gilbert and Mike Etchart.
Serona, it's good to see you. Thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure to be here. Thank you for the opportunity.
We've never get a chance to talk for more than like 10 minutes at a time. And I'm really excited that I have this coffee talk sort of time with you today. I'd love to kick it off with, for those with no prior knowledge, tell me a little bit about your role at University of Miami's Frost School of Music. You're now the interim vice dean, and that's somewhat new for you, right?
Yes. So I wear a number of hats. I've been at the Frost School of Music since 2006. And most of that time was spent being a professor of music industry. We've changed the name of that a little bit over the years, but essentially professor of music industry. And then over time, I ended up becoming the head of the music industry program. And taking on various other additional administrative roles. I did 5 years as an associate dean of administration, which is like running the operations of the school. But then for this school year, the 25-26 school year that we are in now, I'm in a special role that is just a 1-year special role called the interim vice dean. And it's because our current dean of the school, Dean Shelton Berg, he is retiring in May of 2026. And this year he has scaled back on sort of the day-to-day dean responsibilities so that he could focus exclusively on fundraising. And so this role was created to take on those day-to-day dean responsibilities while he is focusing on fundraising and while we get started with searching for our next dean. So at the moment, the plan is not for the vice dean role to continue. Who knows what the future holds, but that's the plan for now.
My wife has been an educator for 30 years, and I wanted to ask you about something that she brought to me, which is sort of the joy of seeing one of your students flourish, succeed. You've been doing this for a while. Talk about some of those little victories where people that have gone through your program that you've gotten to know them, and then they've actually gone on into the industry and thrived.
Oh, there's so many examples, honestly, and I could name so many names. It's like a proud parent moment. I don't have children of my own, and I have to say I get to have that proud mama feeling when they get that first full-time job. That's one of the first first times you just think, oh, yes, they're in, right? And actually it starts before that when they land the great internship. You do feel that as well, but it's even more so when they land that first gig, right? Or they start a company and it's actually off the ground. And then as you watch their career unfold and you watch them go from, being really at an entry level and proving themselves, making a difference, shaping the industry of the future, it is tremendously satisfying. It creates a huge feeling of pride. And then when I'm out at conferences or I'm looking on LinkedIn at posts that are really important and insightful, and it's by a former student, or I'm seeing a former student at a conference or on a panel, I do just sit there and think, oh, look at them go. I'm so excited for them, so proud of them. So it happens all the time. And actually, thank goodness it does, because on a daily basis, sometimes, trying to get your current students to get their head out of Instagram and pay attention, that any teacher can tell you it's hard to keep current students engaged. That's always something we're always working on. But we know that sometimes that real satisfaction comes once they're no longer your student, but they're putting what you taught them into real life and putting it into effect. That's when that real, proud moment comes.
Yeah. I think about this industry and how often it changes and disruption. And I think about your career. You've seen so many different disruptions and changes over the years. I have a presentation that I use, and it's on like version 73 because it's 10 years old, and it used to have master tones in it, and it used to have maybe some Web3 things. Talk about your approach to educating students on a business that's changed while we've been having this conversation.
Yeah. So, it's a great question. And I think to me, it's one of the things that makes music business, music industry education so valuable. I think before I even get into the nitty gritty, what people have to also keep in mind is that when you go to college to study something, it's not training for a specific job, right? Training happens generally when you get a job somewhere, maybe even an internship, and your boss says, I need you to do this thing this way. Here's our policies. Here's our process. Just like this, go do this thing. That's training, right? And that happens in the employee scenario. But when you're studying something in college, it's far beyond that. It's about understanding, concepts that apply across the whole industry and how the whole ecosystem holds together. And so the way we here at the Frost School, and probably other schools too, make sure that what we're teaching is relevant is we don't spin up classes that look like training, right? So for example, there's a tool that we do use in some of our classes, Chartmetric. We don't have a class on Chartmetric. That would be training. What we have is the use of Chartmetric in several classes where whatever you're studying at that time makes sense to be also learning how to use Chartmetric and analyze the data in that tool. So for example, curricular, choices, we have a class on how, recorded music works and distribution and all of that. We have a class on how music publishing works, and we have a class on marketing and promotion. And from a red tape college level bureaucracy perspective, the key is to defining those courses very broadly, right? So that the paperwork that's on the books is really nice and broad and doesn't have to be updated every year, right? You're going to learn the ins and outs of music publishing. You're going to learn all about licensing and rights and royalties, and nice and broad and generic, right? Where you then get into the changes that happen all the time is the actual course itself, the syllabus and the materials. And any music industry program that, dares to call itself that, the faculty, before they set out to teach the course in that topic for this year, they have to crawl through all of the materials from last year, every assigned reading, every lecture that they give, every assignment, every group activity in the classroom, and ask themselves what has changed since last year. and then update all those materials, right? It's a never ending process. You're never finished. But we don't get to just teach the same thing exactly the same way we have last year and the year before and the year before. It doesn't mean you throw most of it out, because a lot of it is foundational knowledge that doesn't change. Right. If you subscribe to the idea that you're teaching people to kind of crawl, walk, run, the crawl and the walk stuff, is pretty foundational. But every single semester, every single class we teach has got to be updated. And so the faculty does that. But because we've defined them broadly, I'm not trying to push through a new course through, 10 levels of committees. Because I don't need to do that, right? If I'm talking about the recording music industry broadly, then I can talk about whatever's happening in that industry in that class very easily with just updating those materials for the students.
Yeah, never a dull moment though.
Never, ever, never a dull moment.
Are there some skills that you consider sort of non-negotiable for graduates, that are entering the workforce in the music industry? And how would those things be taught in practice?
Yes. So I think of them in two buckets, right? One are kind of core business skills, and then the other is, more related to the music business specifically. So from the business skills perspective, the things that I think are absolutely critical, students have to be able to express themselves in writing. Instagram and Twitter don't help us in that regard. And, so much, I can't even count. How many emails have you sent today? It's probably in the digits, right? Yeah. So it's not about writing huge, long research papers, because that's not what life working in the music business is about, but being able to express yourself in writing, in complete sentences, paragraph format, that's important. Being able to analyze information and using tools like Excel, right? Your basic foundational stuff in Excel, I think is a core that they all have to understand. Being able to do a presentation in front of a group of people, putting together slides, whether that's in PowerPoint or Keynote or Prezi or pick your tool, but being able to, present in a way to an audience that is engaging, that is informative, that isn't too much information, it's not too little information, right? Be able to stand in front of a group of people, make eye contact, feel confident, look confident, right? So presentation skills. Being able to map out a project in terms of the sub-steps that have to be done, or the steps and sub-steps along the way, and a timeline for getting those things done, I think is a critical task. And then I'll talk about how we teach these. And
Sure.
then on the music industry side is knowing about different tools that are out there, right? Maybe that is Chartmetric or whatever that may be, knowing how to look up something on the MLC's database, right? As well as ASCAP and BMI's. So having seen and touched some things to say, oh yes, I know how to get to that and I know how to navigate it. And I think the way you teach these, particularly the first set of things I just talked about, those kind of core business skills, is through assignments. Students are given all kinds of different assignments, certainly much more than just take an exam. And those assignments force them to have to practice those skills and then demonstrate that they are able to do them, right? Presentations, Excel analysis, written communications, all of that. And then tools like Chartmetric and looking stuff up in industry databases are also assignments. So that's how we do that.
You touched on a moment ago about how dynamic this business is and how you approach that as an educator, but you took the Baskerville book, which for those that don't know, it's a, for lack of a better term, a textbook for music industry studies, and it covers basically all aspects of the music industry. But you went through that from front to back, correct? And went through all those different areas. I can't even wrap my head around how much work that was to go through this thing. And it's such a great resource. I've marked mine up and dog-eared pages and highlighted things and put in Post-it notes. Talk a little bit about your contributions to the Baskerville book and how you went about that project.
Yes, so that was so exciting, and I'm deep into working on the next edition right now, right?
Of course you are.
Of course I am, right? Of course I am. That's my weekend job. I have so many different jobs. That's my weekend.
Wow.
So the book was originally written in the late 1970s by David Baskerville, and who was both an industry professional and an educator. And about every 3 years or so, he would publish an updated edition because the industry is always changing, right? And eventually his son, Tim Baskerville, came on board, and, eventually David retired and passed away, and Tim took over, getting the book updated every, handful of years. And then in 2021, Tim approached me about taking over the book because Tim wanted to retire. And so I came on board starting with the 13th edition. And, now that I'm very familiar with the book. I used it myself as a student in the early 90s when I did my master's in music industry.
Wow.
And when I first came to academia as a teacher in 2006, I could see here at the Frost School, we were using it. Many other schools were using it, earlier editions. So very, very familiar with the book, and all of its editions. So now that my name was going on the cover, however, I decided, I have to read every single word very, very carefully. And so, with the 13th edition, I kind of look at it like it's like buying a house. And it's this house, you've walked by, it's the house on the hill, and you've looked at it and you're like, that house is amazing. I'd love to have that house one day. That house is so amazing. And it is all the things you think it is. And then you get in and you realize there's some parts of the house that are just amazingly perfect, don't need touching. They're in like pristine. When's Home and Garden's coming to do the photo shoot? Because this room is ready. But then you also find that there's some rooms that you're like, yeah, that needs some work. A touch of paint would be good, right? And then there's some rooms that you're like, yeah, we're taking that back to we're taking the drywall off. We're going back to the studs. We're rebuilding. Right. And so there was no one answer for the book. It depends on the chapter. But, I dug into all of them, and some of them got that full, complete rewrite. And others, got sort of a middle level of editing, and others got a lighter touch. But, it goes hand in hand with what we do as professors to update our courses every year. There's no part of the book that shouldn't be reconsidered. I suppose there's one exception. There's a couple of sections that list out some major milestones in history. Those don't necessarily need to be revisited that much because they are a historical look back. But yeah,
I like the comparison to the house. I think that's a good analogy. Were there any chapters that you felt needed like a complete overhaul?
Yeah, I would say really there was sort of two that stood out to me that needed, I think, a lot of work. I think the first one was the recorded label marketing chapter, because I think the way that chapter had evolved actually was the way record labels evolved. So if you imagine, once upon a time, probably call it like circa 98, 99, right, at a record label, and you were like, oh, there's this thing, digital. Okay. So you spin up like a small sub department of a department. Maybe it's one person, maybe it's two people that start thinking about that, but it's a really tiny little bit, right? And the analogy to that is, you add something to a chapter, it's a new section, but it's a small section. And then over time, as that new thing starts growing and replacing the other things, right? You can't, just like we all saw with restructuring, at some point there was a digital department and a physical department, and then eventually the digital outweighed the physical, and then the physical got absorbed. But then at some point you're like, it doesn't even exist in the way that it used to. It's not a parallel universe. It's a different world. And so the same thing happens with the book. As new topics have been introduced, they grow in size and scale. And at some point you realize actually that entire chapter needs restructuring now. And it needs less to follow perhaps the old structure, but applying it to digital. And it needs to be looked at through an entirely different lens now, because it's important for students to know what came before. And that's a key part about music business education that's different than training, right? When you're training someone, you're like, this is how you do the job now. Got it? Off you go. But when you're educating somebody in a college setting, it's concepts, and then it's how did we get here? What came before and why? And why are we now, dealing with it like this, right? And then you also spend time looking to, well, what's on the horizon? And so I think, when you're taking these chapters, when you're modifying them, you're updating them, at some point it gets to where you still have too much of an old way of thinking and an old structure in there that needs to just come out. It's not going to serve students well to think of things that way. And you have to restructure it as if you were sort of starting from scratch. So the recorded label marketing chapter was one. And then I think the other chapter that I personally jumped into in that same sort of way was the music copyright chapter. Mainly because I think you could talk to a lot of really smart lawyers who could explain music copyright to you. But if you haven't taught it, and you haven't taught it to undergraduate students, which are different than law students, then you perhaps have not really stopped to think about the way to have the concepts build upon each other, and how much is too much detail about something that's very nuanced that only ever a lawyer is going to deal with, and maybe twice in their career. Do I really need to fill an undergrad's mind with that? Or is that just too much information? It's information overload. And so I've taught music copyright to undergrads before. And so I did, do a lot of restructuring of that chapter to really think about it the way I build up their knowledge in a classroom setting.
How did you update the book to reflect sort of the Post-Music Modernization Act, that landscape, the Mechanical Licensing Collective, all of that? How did that play into updating the book?
Yeah, so that mainly, came out in the chapters about music publishing, in the chapters about the chapter about music copyright, the chapter about music licensing, right? The three main components to the MMA. It wasn't just mechanicals, right? There was also the, pre-72 sound recording piece, and then the part having to do with producers getting paid from Sound Exchange. That piece, actually, that latter piece did end up in one of the recording chapters as well. So there was no chapter on the MMA, right? It was integrated into all the places where it was actually impacting how something was done. And so, I, fortunately, because of my own personal professional background, I was very familiar with all of the MMA and the impact that it had. So it was not hard to put it in all the right places.
Let's talk about the MLC for a moment. With your role, did you see any gaps that you wanted to take care of? Anything that you frequently encountered among songwriters?
Yeah. I think there's a couple of key gaps in knowledge that once they are filled, it sort of opens the door, right? So the first gap to me is, and it's for songwriters and all music creators, is really helping them conceptually understand that one behavior can result in two different works under copyright. Once upon a time, songwriters were in one room, they wrote the song, maybe on a piano, maybe on a guitar. They walked in with the sheet music to a different room and handed it to the musicians and the producer. It was very easy to know who did what. They happened at different times, perhaps in different spaces by different people. Today, if someone's making a beat, someone's making a recording, they're writing a song and making a recording all at the same time. And that can be one of the most confusing things for people to understand is that thing you just did, you just created two things. You just wore two hats, possibly even three hats, right? Maybe even four hats, depending on, if you are writing a song, making the recording, you're the artist and you're self-producing, you're just like, you wrote four hats. And then if you don't have a publisher, well, you are self-administered. So you're acting as a publisher, and you don't have a record label, you're an independent artist putting this out, you're acting as a record label. Like, what is that? 5 roles? I've lost count.
Yeah.
But in the creation process, being a songwriter, being an artist, being a digital musician, meaning I'm not playing an instrument, I'm not using my voice, but I am using programmed sounds. That can be the most difficult thing for people to understand. And if you don't start there, and then you just start talking about publishing and records and, this license and that license and musical works and sound recordings, they're like, wait, I just did one thing. Like, did that created both the musical work and the sound recording? So to me, that's one of the gaps that I'd like to start there often, to have people really understand that one activity created two different things. And now we must go down two different paths, right? To talk about those. The other second gap is just that, sometimes people don't pay attention when they sign up for stuff and they click through on things, right? And so I'll meet a songwriter who I'll talk to and they're like, yeah, I'm self-administered. And then I come to find out that actually, no, you signed up with TuneCore Publishing or you signed up with CD Baby Boost. And maybe, you thought it was just small print, you didn't read it. But what you need to understand what you just did, right? You just authorized them to be your publishing administrator for this song, for this particular, set of services they're offering you. You have to pay attention to what you're signing up to.
I'd like you to kind of back up just a little bit for those that are just learning this. Our business can be complex by design, but just talk about the basics of what is the difference between publishing and master? Because I think sometimes even people in the business that don't get into it, they don't really understand how that breaks down.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the ways that I teach about it in class and for the MLC is to use a really concrete example. And so I like to use the song. And by the way, terminology, I know we make it so much more difficult, right? We have multiple words for things.
Yes.
So song or composition or musical work, right? Generally speaking, we tend to use those terms interchangeably. The copyright law calls them musical works. Let's talk about a famous one written by John Lennon and Paul McCartney with the title Yesterday, right? I will not hum it for you because I'm probably going to be out of tune and then I'll lose all of you. But right. Yesterday, okay? You've probably heard it at least once. So that song was written. It could be put on sheet music. I could have an orchestra play Yesterday, not from memory. I could hand each one of them a piece of sheet music on a music stand and have them all play Yesterday for us. Okay, so that is a song, AKA composition, AKA musical work. Now, the Beatles were the first artists that made a sound recording of that, right? Probably the first one that comes to your mind, if you've heard it, is the recording by the Beatles. That is a sound recording. It's a recording of sounds. Not all sound recordings are of music, right? A podcast is a sound recording. An audiobook is a sound recording. Those wave sounds, nature waves that help you go to sleep at night are sound recordings. But in the music business, we're talking about sound recordings of a musical work. So the Beatles recording of Yesterday was the first sound recording of the song written by John Lennon and Paul McCartney. But then after the Beatles recorded it, at this point, it's likely that it's thousands of artists. Other artists have all also recorded the same musical work. Aretha Franklin, Frank Sinatra, Elvis Presley, Boyz II Men, and Vogue. The list is tremendous. And one of the reasons I use this one as an example is because it may very well be the most recorded song ever in terms of, from a pop music perspective. Probably Beethoven or somebody would beat that, but that has ever been recorded. And each of those are separate sound recordings, AKA master, right? We use that term, although I think we're using it less these days. But when people talk about the master, they're often talking about the sound recording, right? That's really what they mean. And those are each separate sound recordings, that each of those have a separate copyright owned by somebody different than the parties that own the copyright in that song by John Lennon and Paul McCartney, right? Which at this point is probably owned or administered by the music publishers that did deals with John Lennon and Paul McCartney. Whereas those sound recordings, that's the record side, right? Those all have artists, they have record labels. So hopefully that was helpful.
Very helpful. I mean, again, some of these things seem obvious to people who've worked in the business a long time, but it's a very complex business. I want to talk a little bit about sort of metadata, and I know it puts people to sleep, so we'll keep this short. But it's so important today on so many different levels. I'd love for you to just talk about what metadata is and what are some common mistakes that prevent accurate mechanical royalty payments based on metadata.
Yeah, my pleasure. So actually, this has been one of my passion topics for most of my career, frankly. I was talking about metadata long before a lot of, other
before it was cool.
Long before it was cool. And I have to say, I have to laugh. I think it was at the very first time at the Music Biz conference where there was the metadata summit.
Yeah.
And we were in a little, little room. It was much smaller than it is. And somebody will come, they'll hear this podcast and they'll say, it was me. She's talking about me. Somebody said, we were trying to think about how to make it sound more interesting. And they said, well, what if we call it metadata? Maybe that will make it sound more interesting. And that just stuck with me. It was one of my European friends, I'm sure, who said that. But it's so metadata, aka metadata.
Thank you.
It's just information. That's all. It's information. And what people don't realize is you deal with information all day, every day. You just don't think about it, right? Like your friend's phone number, that's a piece of metadata. Your name, your first name, your last name, your middle name, your date of birth, all of that is metadata. It's data about you. Right. And metadata means data about data. It's kind of, confusing word construction. But in the music industry, we're talking about information about people, songwriters, artists, musicians, producers, companies, record labels, publishers, right? Parties, use that term more broadly. Information about parties, people, and companies, and information about intellectual property. So we're talking about information about songs, musical works, information about sound recordings, information about videos, and information about products, albums, right? It's just information about these things. And so you get into all different types of metadata, right? It's descriptive information, right? Like a songwriter's name and their unique identifier that songwriters are given when they are part of our ecosystem, right? Songwriters are given something called an IPI. Technically, they're given an IP base number and an IP name number. The name number is what we all see, and everybody calls it the IPI. And think of it like your own passport number or your social security number or your phone number. Pick whatever number you like best. It's a unique identifier to identify one John Smith different than another John Smith, right? That's all it is. So it's knowing about that, knowing, perhaps that songwriter's date of birth to help differentiate them, birth and death dates if they're not around, from another John Smith. It's information about songs, the song title. Who are the writers of the song? What are their names? Songs are given unique identifiers. They're called ISWCs, International Standard Musical Works Codes. ISWC is assigned to a song, composition, musical work when it gets into our ecosystem, right? Sound recordings are given a unique identifier called an ISRC. And for sound recordings, you want to know the name of the artist, the title of the sound recording, the name of the record label, the name of all the musicians who played on that recording, right? So it's really not that scary. It's the kind of thing that, you interact with no matter what. For example, if I'm going on my favorite streaming service to go find the latest new track by whoever, right? I'm looking up a title. There you go. You just interacted with metadata. You didn't think of it that way, but you did. It's everywhere, right? It's almost like you just don't see it till you all of a sudden start really paying attention to it. But it's ever present.
We're finding so many errors, whether it's in, Sound Exchange or wherever it is, because people, we're human and we make mistakes. And sometimes people are fat fingering data in and sometimes they're not. Are there some common mistakes that you find with metadata?
Yeah, I think, first of all, the most common thing is it being missing. So capturing it, memorializing that into something, whether it's an Excel sheet or some software, right? Capturing it in the first place. So having it be missing is one of the first most common problems. And then, so for example, let's say you are an independent artist and you are, you've made a cover of yesterday. Maybe you made a cover of yesterday and you're using, pick your, whatever, there's so many distributors out there, whatever distributor you're going through, and you're typing in fields of information. And let's say one of the fields there that you encounter says writer names. Well, maybe it's not required. So maybe you leave it blank. That would be the first problem. The second thing is maybe you don't really understand what that means and you put your own name, but you didn't write it. John Lennon and Paul McCartney wrote it. So now you have incorrect information, right? So those would be some examples where either it's, that's just one particular field and there are different problems depending on which information we're talking about, but having it be missing or having it be incorrect are the most common problems, I would say. And, that can happen at each point where that information gets then passed along. Did that distributor, when they then sent the recording file and the related metadata to that digital music service, did they include that field or not? Right? That becomes a question. Maybe you did fill it out correctly and you put John Lennon and Paul McCartney, but that didn't get sent from your distributor to the digital service. So now if someone's looking at credits on the digital service, it's blank, right? And so now when that digital service sends that activity to the MLC for mechanicals, right? And we're trying to figure out, well, which yesterday is this? There's no John Lennon, Paul McCartney there, right? So it could be missing, it could be wrong. And I think, at sort of the big budget end of the industry, there are a lot more people whose job it is to get it right. Like that is their entire whole job, right? And they've been doing it perhaps for a long time. They've been thoroughly trained. They know what they're doing. And so sometimes, not always, but sometimes those mistakes happen less at the sort of part of the industry where there is a lot more resources being dedicated to it. Whereas they're more common, perhaps, when you have an independent music creator who's doing it all on their own. They haven't been educated, meaning like no one sat them down and trained them about how to do it. They're trying to figure it out on their own. They're trying their best. They have the best intentions. But they're confused, and it's not hard to understand why it would be confusing. But those are some of the problems.
Is there one policy or sort of change that you think would most dramatically improve songwriter royalty accuracy, going forward?
Yeah, I do think there could be the possibility to require more information to be provided when something is about to enter the stream of commerce, right? So at that point, perhaps it's with record labels or distributors if you're talking about independent artists, but before that sound recording then becomes a product in and of itself, right? When it moves from being just a piece of intellectual property to now it's a commercial product. It's going to be available, right? There is that transition that happens right there, right at that cusp, pre-distribution. There could be, potentially more information required there, and more education about what that information is, how to get it, and why it's important at that stage to reduce how often it is missing and to reduce mistakes. And depending on how far one was to take that, that could range from more required fields, like, for example, making that writer field not optional, but mandatory, all the way to saying, you have to include the ISWC of this song, which means you got to go get it. And of course, to do that, we have to have the right processes in place as an industry to enable that to be assigned very quickly so that, the process of getting new music out there isn't held up in an unreasonable way for these things to be put in place, right? So I think there are opportunities there.
Serona, if you could bust one myth that sort of holds back creators' earnings, what might that be?
I think the myth that comes to mind first is particularly for independent creators who have a lot of work on their plate, right? Many of them are trying to do it all on their own. And I admire that tremendously, right? They're trying to be both that amazing creator and that amazing administrator all at the same time. And as they're prioritizing, what do I want to do today? Do I want to write another song? Do I want to post another, thing on my social media, go live, talk to my fans? Those are probably pretty attractive things to do. And probably somehow they have deprioritized, do I want to go register this song with the MLC or with the PRO today? And I don't blame them. I mean, I get that, right? That's human. That's really human. But the myth that, okay, it's not going to be worth it because there's not enough money that's going to flow to me to make it worth it, so that you're doing the math and you're like, all right, I've got, 10,000 streams. How much money is that going to make me from my PRO? How much money is that going to make me from the MLC? Is it worth me spending an hour doing this? Right? I get that. And it can feel like it may not be worth it. But the truth is, it is worth it, because having all that information there has obviously the direct benefit of making sure that those kind of royalties make their way back to you. But those databases, the MLC's database and the PRO's databases, they are looked at by so many different people in the industry for so many different purposes, right? That let's say, a filmmaker hears your music and they're like, I want to use this music in my film. And they're trying to figure out, who do I go to get a license from, right? And that could be, a lot more money than perhaps your 10,000 streams have earned. But they're trying to figure out, who do I contact? They're going to look at those databases to get the name of the party of who to contact. That's just one example, right? So it can benefit you in all kinds of different ways. And it can benefit you in terms of, if you do hit it big, if all of a sudden that goes viral, right? Something happens and now those 10,000 streams just turned into 10 million streams. Not having put that data where it needs to be already is going to slow down the process of the money getting to you. And so, it's, what do they say? Like, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure or something. I'm probably butchering that, but
no, that's it.
It's worth it. It's worth it.
As we wind down here, let's go through the lightning round. Just some really quick, off the top of the head answers. A music business habit you wish everyone adopted.
Making metadata a priority, treating it like it impacts your paycheck. Thinking of it that way, because it does.
One overlooked career path in music that may be poised for growth.
Okay, so now I'm really guilty of a theme. Data manager. I'm seeing more and more artists and really successful composers and songwriters hiring somebody or having their business manager hire somebody whose job it is just to maintain all this metadata about their catalog, to make sure that it's all correct, and doing really, really granular level income tracking to make sure that they're getting paid everything, which you can't do if you don't have good, clean metadata. So a data manager for creatives on that side is what I'm seeing growth.
Awesome. And the last one, what topic are students interested in that maybe music industry people might be surprised by?
I think students are really passionate about compensation in a way that people might find surprising. It's funny. Students in one of my classes, I have them read, they have to report on a latest music news story that has got a legal focus. So often they're reporting on a lawsuit they just heard about. And if you understand how lawsuits work, right, the first thing filed is always the allegations. And I always have to remind the students, those may or may not turn out to be true. But they get real upset when they're like, this company has not paid this artist this many millions of dollars. And maybe that's true, maybe that's not true. We have to see how that case plays out. But they get so passionate about that compensation. Like, that's not fair. Artists need to be paid fairly. Songwriters need to be paid fairly. It's a topic that really makes them come alive in a way that you might find surprising.
Serona, you are a force of nature. I really appreciate your time. It's always a pleasure when we run into each other. This was sort of the first time we had more than 10 minutes and a cup of coffee to talk. I'm looking forward to our next conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy day. But before I let you go, where can people learn more about what you do? Where can they learn more about the MLC, the MMA? Tell us about that.
Yeah. Sure. Well, thank you for having me, by the way. I've been wanting to do this for so long, and this is yes, check this off my list. I'm so excited. This was such a joy. From an MLC perspective, go to themlc.com. Don't forget that word, themlc.com. And the website's full of resources. Our YouTube channel's full of videos. You're going to recognize the voice. You're going to go, that sounds like Serona. Yeah, there's my voice there and a lot of stuff, but lots of resources on the website and on the YouTube channel. And a great support team that you can get on the telephone. So go to themlc.com. And also from a Frost perspective, right, if you go to frost.miami.edu, you'll see under programs there, you can get to music industry and you can learn much more about our programs there, including our online degrees.
Awesome. Serona, I appreciate everything that you do. Let's talk again soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Yes, let's do that.
You've been listening to Your Morning Coffee, the weekly music news program for the new music business. Join Jay Gilbert and Mike Etchart next time for the digital music news you need to know.